All right. This is the American YAWP, Chapter 14, the Civil War. The American Civil War was fought between 1861 and 1865. Now, here in the United States, we refer to this conflict just simply as the Civil War, but around the world, it's probably more well known as being the American Civil War. So it's fought for 4 years, and in terms of who is fighting against who, it was the North versus the South. If you're not familiar, the term Civil War means a war that happens within a country. So instead of a war between countries, it's a war that essentially like tears a country apart from inside. So in the American Civil War, it was the northern states versus the southern states, or the free states versus the slave states. North and South, respectively, are also sometimes called the Union. We're going to go ahead and write it in blue here because the uniforms for the Union were blue. And the Union was fighting the Confederacy. All right, so certainly you're going to want to be familiar with the terms Union. Union is the North, Confederacy is the South. The American Civil War is the most important event in American history. In terms of the number of people who died, it was 750,000 deaths as a result of the Civil War, which makes it the deadliest conflict in U.S. history, and in fact makes it deadlier than all other conflicts combined. That if you added up the number of Americans who died in war, in every single other war, still more Americans died in the Civil War, right? 750,000. So it is, in the context of U.S. history, a tremendously important conflict. Now, this chapter is going to pick up where the last chapter left off, and that was with the election of 1860. At the very end of chapter 13, there's a little bit there about this presidential election, and there's a little bit about it here. So in the election of 1860, recall that events from last chapter, like Kansas, Nebraska, had taken the old second party system and had more or less wreaked havoc on the political system. That the second party system, which consisted of Whigs and Democrats, that came to an end thanks to the Kansas-Nebraska Act. And so politically, the country is not very stable. Again, it's in a sort of state of chaos. The Democrats, they are the party that survives. They survived the Kansas-Nebraska Act, and so they continue to exist. But in the election of 1860, the Democrats will end up splitting over slavery. And they're going to run two candidates for president, Stephen Douglas and John Breckinridge. Stephen Douglas, this is the same Stephen Douglas from the Compromise of 1850. It's also the same Stephen Douglas that did Kansas, Nebraska. Stephen Douglas, he runs on the for popular sovereignty. Yeah, this is a good key term to know, sovereignty. And that is to say that popular sovereignty is the idea of voting for slavery in a specific territory. So when it came to Kansas, when they opened it up for popular sovereignty, there were some people that said, we want free Kansas. There were some people that said, we want slave Kansas. And then there was Stephen Douglas that said, look, I don't really care if it's free or slave. I just want a legitimate vote. And so his position is free or slave, just as long as the voting is legitimate. Douglas thinks that's sufficient. For many Southern Democrats, this is not acceptable. And so when Douglas is chosen by the party, a group of Southern Democrats say, no, we want our own pro-slavery president. And that's what John C. Breckinridge represents. He represents the pro-slavery position. The Democratic Party has two candidates in the 1860 election. That is never good as far as political strategy is concerned. Now, with the Republicans, remember the Republican Party, this is a brand new party. The Republican Party didn't exist until the Kansas-Nebraska Act. So they are still trying to get their organization down. They're still trying to understand who their candidates are. They're not well established. The Republicans are a party of the North, and very explicitly an anti, we'll say, spreading of slavery party. At this point, they're not explicitly anti-slavery. Well, they're not explicitly abolitionists, meaning they're not calling for an end to slavery inside the whole United States yet. They're simply against the spread of slavery to Western territories. And the Republican Party decides that they're going to nominate Abraham Lincoln to be their candidate. And Abraham Lincoln is chosen because he is an anti-slavery, sort of moderate. He is a well-liked person and has more of a broad appeal. Initially the Republicans, they were going to go for a little bit more of a, sort of a radical anti-slavery candidate, or, someone who is a little bit more abolitionist leaning. But Abraham Lincoln was a good choice because they believed that his anti-slavery message, it could appeal to a much broader section of American society. And so he's seen as this sort of well-liked moderate candidate. He had some very famous debates with Stephen Douglas, so he has a little bit of name brand recognition. And he's also from the state of Illinois, which the Republicans just happen to be holding their national convention. So Republicans will choose Lincoln to run as essentially the northern candidate. Then you have a party that is created overnight, the Constitutional Union Party, and they see the crisis of the 1850s, right? And, we talked about this in an earlier chapter, how the nation was becoming more and more and more divided over this particular decade. The Constitutional Union Party, they are a party created for unity. They see Northerners and Southerners becoming further divided on this issue of slavery. And they're hoping that in this election, maybe they can come together and appeal to the national identity of Americans, say, look, why can't we all just get along? Right? I like to sometimes call the Constitutional Union Party the party of why can't we all just get along? So, and they run John Bell, right? He's Constitutional Union, and we'll just say wanted to avoid secession. Secession. And if you're unfamiliar, secession, this is a good term to identify. Secession, or to secede, essentially means to break away. Right? So when a state secedes or a territory secedes, it means that they are breaking away from the rest of the country. And when the election was all said and done, it was Abraham Lincoln, the Republican Northerner, who ended up winning the election. Lincoln got 40% of the popular vote. And it was his victory in this election that led to the immediate secession crisis. And that was, tension had been building up between the Union and the Confederacy all during the 1850s. You had the crisis over California, the crisis over Nebraska, the Dred Scott decision. But once Abraham Lincoln won that election of 1860, it was South Carolina that became the first state to secede from the Union. So we'll say about South Carolina secession, the first state to secede from the Union. And again, by Union, we just mean United States. And this was on December 20th, I want to say, 1860, right? December 6th, 1860. Now, when South Carolina voted to secede in their state legislature, it was pretty much a slam dunk. The vote was 169-0. Everyone in the South Carolina state legislature decided that secession was the best course of action from this point forward. But what made this crisis especially alarming was the fact that after South Carolina had seceded from the Union, 6 other states joined them to create a separate entity called the Confederate States of America. We might just say about the Confederate States of America that 6 others states seceded to form the Confederate SA, Confederate States of America, their own separate government. And those states were, and not that you probably have to know this, but let's see if I can actually just test myself and remember this. Alabama, Florida, Mississippi, Louisiana, Alabama, Florida, Mississippi, Louisiana, Texas. Who did I leave out? Oh, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Alabama, Florida. Oh, duh, Georgia. Georgia. So these states, Alabama, Florida, Mississippi, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas, joined South Carolina. Right? Maybe we'll just put plus South Carolina. Formed the Confederate States of America, which established itself as a separate entity from the United States. So when we say it was the Union versus the Confederacy, that is where these two terms come from, right? The Union and Confederacy. Now, as far as secession and the purposes for it, we have several sources, in fact, 3 sources of evidence that establish the founding of the Confederacy and the reason for secession to be primarily based off of the institution of slavery. So the first one we have here is a speech that was given by Alexander Stephens, who is the vice president of the Confederacy. He says, quote, this is called I don't think it's actually in, no, it's not actually in here, but this is called the Cornerstone Speech. And in the Cornerstone Speech, the vice president says, quote, foundations are laid. Its cornerstone, there it is. Its cornerstone rests upon the great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man, that slavery is his natural and normal condition. Alexander Stephens. Similarly, from the Mississippi Statement of Secession says, quote, our position is thoroughly identified with the institution of slavery, the greatest material interest in all the world. Mississippi State Secession, Statement of Secession. And the last point is the Confederate dollar, which we can see very clearly, at least on this part here, that you have 2 enslaved individuals being portrayed here, and looking at the Confederate dollar and the inclusion of the institution of slavery being front and center, that in the speeches and the statements of secession, that it was very clear for those at the time who were involved in creating the secessionist movement that slavery was, in Alexander Stephens' words, the cornerstone of the Confederacy. As the textbook puts it, slavery's existence was the essential core of the Confederacy. Now, even in the face of secession, there were still some that had hoped that perhaps there could be a peaceful outcome, that perhaps these southern states could be brought back if only the right deal was made. And so a senator, I want to say, from Kentucky, Crittenden, decided upon the Crittenden Compromise as a last-ditch effort to bring the southern states back. The Crittenden Compromise essentially would propose to extend slavery further west. It wanted to establish the Missouri Compromise line and just keep that throughout the entire United States. So hearkening back to an era in which the country would stay half free, half slave. This was rejected by both the North and the South. Right? This last-ditch effort to prevent secession did fail. Now, for the Confederacy, they would create their own constitution that would share many similarities to the U.S. Constitution. In terms of the governing documents, not all that much is relevant here, but we should note that the first and only president of the Confederacy was Jefferson Davis. Jefferson Davis, we'll say, was elected the first and only president of the Confederacy. Section 3, a war for Union, 1861 to 1863. So the Confederacy had not only broken away, but had elected a president and established themselves as a separate government even before Lincoln had set foot into office. You know, typically when a president is elected, they're elected in November, but they don't actually become the president until a couple of months later, right? January, February. Back then, I want to say that Lincoln didn't become president until even March of that year. So by the time that Lincoln had set foot into office, 7 states left the U.S. before Lincoln's first day as president. So when it was said earlier that Lincoln had faced a task that was greater than the task faced by Washington, they weren't kidding. It's, you can imagine coming in first day on the job, welcome to the presidency, Abraham Lincoln, 7 states are gone. What are you going to do about it? Lincoln, in his inaugural address, the inauguration is when the president is brought in. They usually give a speech. He had stated that secession is illegal. And in fact, this would be Lincoln's stance throughout the entire Civil War, that the 7 states in the Confederacy, they actually didn't secede. They are still part of the United States. Lincoln would instead use the term rebellion, right? These are states in rebellion. They're still part of the U.S. because legally they can't leave. So they hadn't seceded. And so that way, Lincoln would still have jurisdiction over those particular states. Now, up until this point, things were pretty tense, but there hadn't been any outright violence. That was until the events at Fort Sumter. And the events at Fort Sumter, these are considered to be the first shots fired in the U.S. Civil War. Or maybe a simpler way of putting it is this was the start of the Civil War. See, Fort Sumter was a federal fort. And as a federal fort, and this was South Carolina, so we'll put SC for short, it technically wasn't property of the state of South Carolina. In fact, you had this situation play out in a couple of other states, and that was, think of something like a military base. A military base is property of the federal government. So when a state like South Carolina secedes, what do you do with Fort Sumter? And the answer is that most of these federal forts they turn themselves over to local governments, right? So if there was a military base in Georgia and Georgia seceded, most of those on the base just said, okay, we're going with Georgia. Well, Fort Sumter was different in that it was located in water, right? It was surrounded by water. It was out there in Charleston Harbor. And so when South Carolina told the people in Fort Sumter, look, South Carolina, we've seceded. We demand you turn over this fort to the state of South Carolina. The people in the fort said no. And so there was this very tense standoff that, in fact, Abraham Lincoln himself was worried about. He was worried that the people in Fort Sumter were going to starve to death if no supplies got to them. But eventually, South Carolina, I don't know if they lost their patience or what do you want to call it, but South Carolina would eventually fire upon the fort. After 33 hours of bombardment, Fort Sumter surrendered to the state of South Carolina, and it was upon the firing on Fort Sumter, the takeover of Fort Sumter by the state of South Carolina, that Abraham Lincoln called up for a volunteer army to deal with whatever this secession movement was at that time, right? And so this was the turn towards violence, the starting of the actual war itself. Now, initially, the North took on a strategy known as the Anaconda Plan. This is the Northern strategy to starve the Confederacy into surrender. And given the Southern economy and what we learned about the Southern economy from our previous chapters, we know that the Southern economy had been completely dominated by the industry of cotton. And so, for the Southern war effort to continue, it was vital that cotton shipments leave and money come in. Because for the most part, the Confederate economy was not prepared to produce stuff related to the war, right? They were not prepared to make a lot of guns or have a lot of railroads or anything like that. So, if the North could cut off cotton shipments from the South, that would go a long ways in terms of allowing the Union or the North to win this war. So we see an image here, Scott's Great Snake, Winfield Scott. He was the general in charge of Union forces at the very beginning of the war, not for very long, but the idea is to slowly squeeze the South into submission. And this was also coming at a time when, when the war started, a lot of people believed the war would be over very soon. The North had a lot of advantages in terms of more soldiers and better technology. And so, Northerners were very confident in a quick victory. And the Anaconda Plan of squeezing the South or starving the South into submission, that was also a way of inflicting minimal damage on, fellow Americans at that point. The Civil War would turn into a far bloodier and far more desperate conflict than what it was at the very beginning. Now, when the firing of Fort Sumter occurred, there was some sort of violence coming. At the time, I don't think anyone understood, maybe very few people like William Tecumseh Sherman, very few people understood that this was going to be as long and as deadly of a conflict, right? People thought that would be over pretty quickly. But it meant that people had to choose sides, right? And so after Fort Sumter happened, it was time to choose sides, right? Some sort of violence, some sort of war is coming. What are we going to do? This meant people had to decide, are you for the Union or for the Confederacy? This also meant that states had to decide, are you for the Union and are you for the Confederacy? And initially, only 7 states had made up the Confederacy. But after Fort Sumter, more slave states in the South would join them. Probably the most important one was the state of Virginia, right? Virginia, which was an important state because it had a big population, important because it had been home to a lot of U.S. presidents. Virginia decided that they would join the Confederacy, right? Join the Confederate States of America. A couple of other states decided, North Carolina, Tennessee, Arkansas, those states decided for the Confederacy. Everyone else decided for the Union or the North. But there were a set of states that are of particular importance that we should know, and these are called the border states. Now, the border states, you might think conventionally, well, aren't these just the states on the border between the North and the South? Well, geographically, that's where they lie, but that's technically not what a border state is. A border state is a slave state that fights on the side of the North, right, or of the Union. So again, a border state is a slave state that fights on the side of the North. And it's going to make conducting this war a little bit more complicated, right? It kind of throws a wrench into the system. What are our border states? Well, our border states are Delaware. And Delaware, for the most part, let me spell that right. Delaware is, in terms of the makeup of the state, Delaware at this point maybe resembles more of a northern state than it does a slave state, but slavery was still legal there. Delaware fights on the side of the North pretty easily, right? They see themselves maybe more of a northern state. The second one is Maryland. Now, Maryland, this was a state that was occupied by Union troops very early on because the capital of the United States was in Washington, D.C., which is on the border of Maryland and Virginia. So for the North, they couldn't let Maryland secede because that would mean that the nation's capital would be separated from the rest of the country. So Maryland was forced to fight for the Union pretty early on. It was militarily occupied. Missouri is also another slave state that fights for the North, again, occupied by the North. Missouri is located more in the West, so it wasn't really central, I would say, to the Civil War. It's still kind of Wild West at that time, but slavery was legal there, and it was on the side of the Union. And then Kentucky, and to Kentucky's credit, Kentucky was probably the state that tried to truly stay neutral as long as possible, but eventually they would side with the Union and fight for the North. So again, border states, slave states that fights on the side of the North. Our border states are Delaware, Maryland, Missouri, and Kentucky. Now, in order to conduct this war, Abraham Lincoln suspended what was known as habeas corpus, and this was done specifically inside of Maryland to secure the capital of Washington, D.C. Habeas corpus, generally speaking, is sort of the right to a trial. And so Lincoln will say suspended habeas corpus to secure Maryland. And this was to make sure that Maryland would fight on the side of the on the side of the Union. As the war got underway, though, right, as the North was invading the South, and we look at the overall strategy of the conflict, the South is seceding, the North is trying to prevent them from seceding. So it's really up to the North to attack. The Union, again, they would be required to go on the offensive, right? And we would also say of the Union, they have most of the advantages. And that means the North has a bigger army, they have more weapons, they have better weapons, they have more money, they have more railroads, they have a better navy, they have a more efficient government. So, a lot of people were expecting the Union to win, including, those in the Union. But the fact that it was the Union that had to be on the offensive, again, they have to go into the South and bring the South back in. That was an element of strategy that actually benefited the Confederacy, right? The Union would have to be on the offensive. This also meant that most of the war would be fought in southern states. And as Union armies began to make their way in places like Maryland, which we talked about earlier, what they found was that the people who were enslaved in those areas were very eager to make it to Union lines. And so pretty soon Union generals were faced with a somewhat of an issue at the time. And that was the fact that many people who were enslaved had been joining their armies. And at the time, there really wasn't a consensus policy or position in which the United States or Union Army should take. Lincoln, during his, really off with the spelling, Lincoln in his first inaugural, right, when he became president, said no intention of ending slavery where it exists. Remember, Lincoln, the Republican candidate, he was only against the spread of slavery at this point, not against ending slavery where it exists. And so he had said this when he was first elected president. And so now you have these generals who are getting one kind of version from Lincoln saying, look, we're not actually abolishing slavery as we go. And then you have the reality. And the reality is wherever Union armies are going, slavery is effectively coming to an end. And so we might say the official policy or one of the standings would be that any enslaved individual that made it to Union lines, technically, according to Lincoln, those people were not free. And so what do you do with these people? Do you return them back to their enslavers? Do you send them back to the South? Do you keep them with the camp? This became a problem. Union generals began to protect enslaved individuals who had made it to their lines. And they had used this term contraband to describe exactly those people. So, contraband, this is a name or a term for enslaved people who had escaped to Union armies. And some generals will say protected their freedom. All right, some of these Union generals were protecting their freedom, regardless of what Lincoln had said during his, presidential address, a little bit earlier. So pretty much the logic was from these Union generals said, look, when we conquer a Southern army, we can take their weapons, we can take their clothing, we can take all their stuff. If the Confederacy considers enslaved people property, then we should be able to confiscate their property, right? That these people are quote unquote contraband. And that's what contraband is, right? Contraband is confiscated property. Congress, weighing in on this decision, favored the select generals who were offering this protection. And so they passed a law called the First Confiscation Act. This protected generals who had taken quote unquote contraband. And, this is an important point because when we think about the way that slavery was abolished in this country, right, most of us can say, well, it was the American Civil War. But in terms of exactly and precisely when, slavery wasn't, slavery wasn't abolished at the beginning of the war. Slavery wasn't abolished at the end of the war. Slavery is going to be abolished in the middle of the war. And one of the reasons that Lincoln comes to this decision, right, he changes his mind. Well, at least publicly, he changes his mind because some people might point out that, look, Abraham Lincoln was just saying this in his first inauguration because he didn't want any of the other slave states to secede. So let's not try and read Lincoln's mind here. But at least Lincoln changed his position publicly. At the beginning of the war, saying he has no intention of ending slavery. During the middle of the war, he issues his Emancipation Proclamation, which effectively ends slavery. And one of the reasons is because there was a reality happening on the ground that U.S. or Union generals were effectively ending slavery wherever they went, and Congress had issued protections for those Union generals that did. And at least from the perspective of the generals, at the very least, right, they would say that ending slavery contributes, ending slavery contributes to Union victory, right? If anything else, the abolition of slavery in the South could weaken the Southern war effort. And so as a pure tactic, right, as a pure part of military strategy, we in the North, we should be ending slavery because that's going to make the Confederacy weaker, and that is going to allow the Union to win. So this certainly has a role to play in terms of Lincoln's decision-making process when he eventually does come to the decision to issue his Emancipation Proclamation. Right? It's not yet, but it will come soon. Now, as far as the actual fighting in the Civil War is concerned, we will be talking about some important turning points and specific battles and how it ends up changing the overall conflict. Now, when we talk about the American Civil War, it's primarily fought in two theaters. And a theater is just a term that historians use to describe a specific area of fighting, right? In the United States or in the Civil War, there is the Eastern Theater and the Western Theater. The Eastern Theater, this is mostly the area between Richmond, Virginia, and Washington, D.C. Right, we would say mostly in Virginia. And these are the large armies. And this is, we might call it the quote unquote main theater of the war. It's going to get most of the attention. It will be the area in which the war is fought and won or lost. Right? So the Eastern Theater, that's the main theater. We're mostly talking about the area around Richmond and DC. Richmond is the Confederate capital. The Confederacy decides to put their capital city at Richmond, Virginia. The capital of the United States, of course, is Washington, D.C. And so a lot of military engagement around those two cities because both sides are trying to capture the capital city of the other one. The Western Theater is pretty much everywhere else, right? Everywhere else. This is fought over a much bigger area. The armies themselves maybe tend to be smaller, but the Western Theater is mostly about the North trying to cut off supply lines. All right, so in the West, it's not so much about going and capturing the capital city or going out and defeating the other army. It's mostly about the North going out and trying to take over rivers or trying to cut off railroads. The Confederate army is in Virginia. All the supplies, reinforcements, everything else comes from the Confederacy and heads towards Virginia. Can the Western Theater, can they, help, cut off some of those supplies? Now, as far as the fighting is concerned, Fort Sumter, believe it or not, after 33 hours of gunfire, actually didn't result in anyone dying, but it did result in the surrendering of the fort. Now, given the advantages that the Union have, initially the Union strategy was to raise an army, march right towards Richmond, Virginia, and capture it. And so when the Union Army was en route to Richmond, Virginia, they met a Confederate army at the Battle of Bull Run. The Battle of Bull Run is the first major battle of the Civil War, right? Of the Civil War. This is fought in the Eastern Theater, right? So it's fought between Richmond and DC. It's in Virginia. And initially, the Battle of Bull Run didn't go, it was going according to plan for the Union. But eventually, when Confederate reinforcements showed up, when the full and true, capacity of the railroads could be witnessed, the American Civil War, in some sense, is one of the first wars to use railroads extensively. They were somewhat of a new technology. The tide of the battle turned, and at the end of the day, it was a Confederate victory. And the Confederate victory at the Battle of Bull Run causes the North to make some pretty considerable changes. They fire their military leadership. They're going to find a new general here. The strategy of slowly squeezing the South into submission. Of course, the North is still going to want to cut off supplies, so the Anaconda Plan is still valid in that way. But the idea of having minimal bloodshed, that's going to go out the window. Right. In fact, the U.S. Congress authorizes something like a military of like 2 million. A quick victory or the lack of a quick victory also led to people in the North to increasingly speak out against the war. Right. If this was a war that was over very quickly with very little bloodshed and the Union won very quickly, that could get a lot of support. But the longer that the war went on and the more and more bloodshed that it caused, increasingly, there are people in the North who will speak out against the war. We call these Copperheads, right? Copperheads, these are anti-war Northerners. As your textbook calls them, peace Democrats. Peace Democrats. And this was something that Lincoln would continue to have to contend with during his entire presidency. There'll be a certain contingency of Northerners who may not even be like pro-slavery or pro the Confederacy, but they just don't see the bloodshed as being worth it. And this is an era in which photography is really coming into its own. And so people were getting not firsthand accounts, but they were getting, images from the battlefield of the carnage and the brutality of the war. And Northerners had to ask themselves, is all this bloodshed worth it? Is it worth to continue fighting? Or should the Confederacy simply be allowed to, leave? Now, there is a very brief part of the textbook that talks a little bit about what life was like as a soldier. Not going to go into too much detail here, but for the most part, life as a soldier was characterized by routine. There was a saying that, in the morning, soldiers drill. In the afternoon, soldiers drill. And at night, soldiers drill. And the question was, well, what do you do after you drill? And the answer is, well, you drill, 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 and drill more. So a lot of routine in terms of training, preparing, drilling, preparing for the war. Music was also enjoyed by a lot of the soldiers that were in camp, both Union and Confederacy, and writing. This is a war in which there are many soldiers who are literate. In fact, many more soldiers than in the past. And so we have an abundance of letters and primary sources and firsthand accounts of soldiers who had, participated in the war directly. So when the first, stages of the war are fought out, the war initially, at least from the perspective of the Union, given the disaster of Bull Run, is nothing but it's a disaster, right? The war is not going very well for the North. And so they fire their military leadership, and instead they're going to appoint George McClellan. We'll just say that he's appointed Union general in the Eastern Theater. All right, so George McClellan is our first U.S. general to know here. And he is given command of the Army of the Potomac. The Army of the Potomac, this is the Union Army in Virginia. And to make a connection to some of the earlier chapters that we discussed, specifically the ones about industrialization, the Army of the Potomac is one of the most well-equipped fighting forces, maybe arguably the most well-equipped fighting force that has ever set foot on planet Earth, right? The industrial northern United States at the time has the railroads, the telegraphs, the factories. It has everything that it needs in order to create the most formidable army, and that's exactly what the Army of the Potomac is. For the Confederacy, Robert E. Lee is appointed as the Confederate general. He actually does not begin the war in a position of field command, but he eventually is appointed Confederate general of the Eastern Theater. All right, Eastern Theater. And the Confederate Army is appropriately called the Army of Northern Virginia. So this is the Confederate Army. Say Confederate Army. Let's say just in. All right, and so we're talking about the years primarily 1862 till about 63. It is McClellan for the North and Lee for the South. Now, when 1862 rolls around, it's time for the Union to launch their second offensive. The first one at the Battle of Bull Run had failed. And their second offensive against Lee and the Confederates is called the Peninsula Campaign. So the Peninsula Campaign specifically, we'll call this the Second Union Offensive. And the strategy was to transport Union troops by boats and attack Richmond from behind. That was the goal. One of the other strategies that the Union had all during the war was a superior Navy. And so McClellan believed that using the Navy to move the Union Army to attack Richmond from behind would be a would be a better task, right? It might, include something like the element of surprise. But unfortunately for the Union, the Peninsula Campaign, much like the First Offensive, would also fail. And there are a couple of reasons for that, but the most important one, and this, unfortunately, for George McClellan, who was in charge of Union forces during this campaign, is the way that we remember McClellan as a general. And we might just point out that the Peninsula Campaign failed because McClellan was overly cautious. He was not fast enough in his movements. He was not aggressive enough. He was not decisive enough. In fact, McClellan believed that the Confederate army was way, way bigger than it actually was. And so when we think about McClellan's name, it becomes somewhat synonymous with the fact that he just didn't press the advantage. Here he has in the Army of the Potomac, again, what we might consider one of the most formidable fighting forces ever to set foot on planet Earth. But this overly cautious approach, not wanting to send his soldiers recklessly into battle, believing the Confederate army was way, way bigger than it was, it simply just takes too long. And the Peninsula Campaign is not successful in capturing the Confederate capital city of Richmond. And so, especially for expectations, this is very, very bad for the North because the North is supposed to have all the advantages. And if this war was to end quickly, it should have ended by now in a Union victory. So, once again, the Eastern Theater, as we mentioned before, in 1861, it was a disaster. In 1862, it's a disaster. However, though, in the West, where Ulysses Grant is, things are going according to plan. Ulysses Grant, we'll just describe Grant as the Union general in the West. And maybe not Union general, just a Union general, because the story of Ulysses S. Grant really is the story of someone who rises through the ranks. When war breaks out, he's not a coveted military leader. In fact, he's kind of down on his luck. He's suffered alcoholism his entire life. And he gets a position of military leadership simply because there really isn't anyone to choose from. But during the course of the war, Grant will build a reputation and career for himself for winning battles, right? So he starts off the war relatively unknown, has success in the West, and will eventually at a certain point be appointed to being the general in the East, right? Being the main general in Virginia, but not now. Some of the Union victories in the West included the Battle of Shiloh. We'll call this a Union/Grant victory in the West. I want to say that this was fought along the Mississippi River. Again, a lot of what was going on in the West was like fighting over rivers and other sort of transit or transportation routes. The Battle of Shiloh was especially brutal. 23,000 casualties at this battle. And that was more than all other U.S. casualties combined. Meaning that more Americans, or the United States suffered more casualties at one single battle than they did in all of the other wars put together. And that was really giving some insight to the size and scope of this conflict. Now, the term casualty is a little bit confusing because casualty is not technically a death, but it includes deaths. So when we say casualties, we usually mean soldiers who died, soldiers who are injured, or soldiers that are missing in action, right? Either deserted or left. It's a term that was used by military leaders to describe, okay, how many soldiers do we have left fighting? So if you suffer 23,000 casualties, it just means you're down 23,000 soldiers. Either they were killed or injured, missing in action. They just can't fight anymore. So sometimes deaths and casualties are used interchangeably. Technically, they're not the same thing. But at the very least, this was a victory for the Union. This was a victory for Grant. And even though it was, incredibly deadly and bloody and brutal, this is what the Union had expected. Similarly, New Orleans, which was the biggest / most important Confederate city, was captured by the Union in 1862. All right, so New Orleans, it was the city at the mouth of the Mississippi River, so anything coming out of the Mississippi has to go through New Orleans. It was captured early on by the North, and this is what the North expected as far as the war. They expected to be able to take control of some of these cities pretty quickly. Now, another point here, and this is maybe more of a fun fact, but it does get to the point about the Civil War being a more modern war, and that is the role in which technology played. So, for example, we had mentioned earlier about the railroads. The Civil War is one of the first conflicts in which you see extensive railroad use. It's also one of the first wars in which you see telegraphs being used, right? The ability to transport troops via the railroad over long distances or to be able to communicate over long distances. You hadn't had wars that had used these things to great extent. This is the first major war since the steam engine. And so we see one way in which this plays out in naval warfare when it comes to the types of ships that are engaged in combat. And that is to say that the American Civil War is the first war in which two ironclad ships, and an ironclad is just a ship made from iron, right? Or, metal at the very least. Metal. We'll say engage in battle for the first time in world history. And again, this is maybe just something like a fun fact or like a trivia question. It does have a point to go with the theme of technology in the war. But, the first time that two ships that were made out of iron engaged in a battle with each other was during the American Civil War. And of course, from that point onwards, building ships out of wood would never be the case again. The reason why they didn't make ships out of iron before was because the way that you powered these ships was wind power via sails. And it was only until you had the invention of the steam engine that you can make ships heavy enough to essentially do that. So here we see the way that technology has played a role. Now, when the war was proceeding, Lincoln was privately contemplating the decision to issue emancipation, especially as the war progressed and especially as the war, wasn't going as well for the Union side. And so the relationship between slavery and the war, this changed during the war. Maybe we'll just make a note about that, right? Slavery and the war, that this changed during the war. And I think the point earlier is a good one to reiterate, and that is slavery was not abolished at the beginning of the Civil War. It was not abolished at the end of the Civil War. It was abolished during the war. And so Lincoln had to contend with a few realities. One was that enslaved people were running two Union lines, right, or running two Union forces, right? And wherever Northern armies went, you effectively had emancipation taking place. The second thing is that the Confiscation Acts, Congress would actually go on to pass another one. protected generals, and in a practical sense, practically ended slavery where the army went, right? So that is, even before Abraham Lincoln said anything, wherever the armies had been going, slavery was practically coming to an end in those areas. And the third thing was Lincoln himself. And again, I don't know how much we want to play mind reader on Lincoln to say, well, when did Lincoln actually decide in his head that he was going to end slavery? Was it before the war? Was it during the war? Regardless of that, Lincoln was faced with the reality that Lincoln, by wanting to come out and issue the Emancipation Proclamation, Lincoln did not want a proclamation to end slavery. Lincoln did not want a proclamation to end slavery to look desperate. And that was revealing the fact that the beginnings of this war didn't go well. And if Lincoln were to come out after a series of military defeats and say, okay, now we're ending slavery, that would look like just a simple, desperate ploy to try and win the war. And one thing that the Union and Confederacy both contended with, and we hadn't really mentioned this, and your textbook does mention a little bit about this, is the possibility of foreign intervention. One of the ways in which the Confederacy can win the Civil War is that if a foreign nation, let's say Britain, is willing to come in and aid the Confederacy. And so it's very important for Lincoln to make the war look like it was under control, right? That the Union was victorious. And so, given these three realities, Lincoln came to the decision that he would issue a proclamation ending slavery, but he would only do so after a Union victory, right? That the Union needed to have some good news on the battlefield first. And then once some good news came and things looked better for the Union war effort, then he could come out and issue that declaration. And that's exactly what he did following the Battle of Antietam. The Battle of Antietam was, at the time, shocking for some Northerners because this was a Confederate invasion of Union territory. I will say Union soil. It was fought in Maryland. And if you would have gone back at the beginning of the Civil War and told a Northerner to look, if this Civil War breaks out, the Confederacy has the potential to invade the North, they would have thought that you were crazy. Because given all the advantages that the North has, not only would that have been crazy in terms of like the Union winning the battle, seeing themselves as being able to win the battles, but many would have thought that the war would be over by now. So when Confederate armies stepped foot on Union soil, that was, I wouldn't say not quite the reason to panic, but, you're getting pretty close to panicking if you're on the northern side. However, though, the Battle of Antietam was enough of a Union victory, and the Confederate army in Maryland was forced to retreat back to Virginia. McClellan eventually does get fired, so his tenure as the Union general doesn't last too long. But this Union victory paved the way for Lincoln to issue his Emancipation Proclamation, which came in September of 1862. It would go into effect January 1863. And in effect, what Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation did was it freed the slaves under Confederate control. Essentially, it was an ultimatum. It was for the Confederacy to either surrender or Lincoln would abolish slavery in those Confederate states. This was issued on the one hand to weaken the Confederate war effort, right? So you can look at the Emancipation Proclamation as somewhat of a war measure, but maybe more importantly, after the Emancipation Proclamation was issued, this would fundamentally change the meaning of the war. So this section here, section 3, is called, quote unquote, the War for Union, meaning at this stage of the war that, arguably this was more about keeping the Union together. But after the Emancipation Proclamation, the next section, in fact, is called the War for Emancipation. And so when Lincoln issued this in September of 1862, it meant a very simple equation. And that is, if the Union wins, then slavery is abolished, right? And that would be the victory conditions for the Union as the war would continue. Now, an important thing to note here is that the Emancipation Proclamation, when it says that it freed the slaves under Confederate control, this is literally, the literal definition, right, of it. And what we mean by that is that border states, because we have these border states, the border states do not count, meaning that Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation does not free the slaves in places like Delaware. It does not free the slaves in Maryland. It does not free slaves in Kentucky. It only frees those slaves in Confederate control. Now, how many Confederate states took Lincoln up on this offer? Again, you can think about the proclamation as being an ultimatum: surrender or Abraham Lincoln will free the slaves. 0, right? All of the states of the Confederacy continued to fight. And from January 1st, 1863, the fundamental meaning of the war had changed. This was no longer just an explicit war for union. This was now a war for emancipation. Section 4, War for Emancipation, 1863 to 1865. So one of the key points during the Civil War was Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation. And we mentioned in the last section how this made the war explicitly about the abolition of slavery. That became part of the conditions if the Union were to win. However, though, it had an impact on the war in more than one way. And one way that it changed the war was the way in which Black men would serve in the war directly. That is to say that the Emancipation Proclamation paved the way, or maybe we should go ahead and list it out here. We'll say that the Emancipation Proclamation paved the way for Black soldiers in the Union Army. And that is also to suggest, which is true, that when the Civil War began, it was a war in which only involved white troops fighting for both sides. So it was a war in which initially all the soldiers were volunteers when the war started. That would change as both sides would institute a draft. It was also a war in which white troops were used for both sides exclusively. By the time the war ends, approximately 10% of the Union Army is Black soldiers. African Americans fought in the Union Army under the USCT. This stands for the United States Colored Troops. And as we mentioned earlier, about 10% of the Union Army. So the Union is mobilizing, Black men in a way that wasn't true at the beginning of the war. But one thing to keep in mind is that these units are segregated, meaning that white and Black soldiers are fighting for the same side, but they're not actually fighting next to each other. There are all white regiments and all Black regiments. And that for the Black soldiers that did enlist, they were paid less money than their white counterparts. This was something, the enlistment of black men was something that some had been advocated from the very beginning. In fact, the very famous abolitionist Frederick Douglass, who had somewhat regular correspondence with Lincoln during the war, he was always someone who had encouraged Lincoln to enlist black men. From Douglass's perspective, he had said, look, there's really nobody in the country who has more to fight for than African Americans, given the nature of the conflict. He says, quote, once let the black man get upon his person the brass letter U.S., which, again, if you sign up to the military, you get the letters. There is no power on earth which can deny that he had earned the right to citizenship, Frederick Douglass. And here we have a photo called Two Brothers in Arms of two black soldiers fighting for the Union side. As they would say in those days, the black men in blue, blue being the uniform for the, for the Union Army. Your textbook does mention also the way in which enslaved black men and women were mobilized for the Confederate Army, or the enslaved Confederates. So we'll just say that these were the slaves that accompanied the Confederate Army. And the 3 points the book makes is that for those slaves who accompanied the Confederate Army, this was coerced labor, meaning that they did not have a choice as to whether or not they were there to support the army. The second is that while there was certainly no denying that the Confederate was fighting to preserve slavery, that those who were enslaved could still show some concern for, their sort of fellow people, right? Those around them, including those who were enslavers and Confederate soldiers. I think the textbook even uses the quote, people are complicated. So it was possible for someone who was enslaved to want the Confederate to lose the war, but could still show some concern for those people around them. And the third point was that white Confederates did not see African Americans as equals. And so this got back to the point about when we talked about the Emancipation Proclamation. Let's go. Proclamation. As, in one way, you could understand it as a war tactic, meaning freeing or abolishing slavery in the states of the Confederacy would actually weaken the Confederate war effort, because a lot of times these enslaved individuals were brought along with these armies. And for every slave that was providing labor, that meant there was one extra free white person in the South who could then enlist in the army. So getting rid of slavery could also be understood as a tactic to win the war. But as the war resumed, January 1st, 1863 rolled around, and none of the states of the Confederacy had opted for surrender, and so the war would continue. It was marked by a dramatic change in the course of the war. Recall that in the Eastern and Western theater, in the West, thanks to people like Ulysses S. Grant, the Union was having tremendous victory. However, in the East, in Virginia, this was Union defeat. And in fact, the war could not have really gone any more poorly for the Union up until this point. Well, 1863 is a turning point, because now in this year, after the proclamation, the conditions of the war start to turn in favor of the Union. And of all of the battles in the entire Civil War, the most important battle is the Battle of Gettysburg, right, in 1863. And this is considered by many, and I don't think your textbook actually marks this, but is considered by many to be the turning point of the war, where things start going according to plan. The Battle of Gettysburg, or the Gettysburg Campaign, this was the second Confederate invasion of the North. So once again, the Confederacy is on the move into Union territory, meaning that the war has gone much better for the Confederacy up until this point. This was fought in Pennsylvania. So it's being fought on free soil. It was a 4-day battle, 51,000 casualties, making it the deadliest battle for Americans during the Civil War. But most importantly, it was a Union victory. And when the Union won the Battle of Gettysburg, it turned the Confederate Army back to the South, forcing the Confederacy to go back to Virginia once again. And in fact, this would be the last time that the Confederacy would ever be able to invade Union territory. It was the most northern point that the Confederacy had ever gotten. And so from this point onwards, the way in which the Confederacy was able to attack and pressure the North, that's going to dissipate. At the Battle of Gettysburg, it is typically cited that Pickett's charge, this was a failed Confederate attack at the Battle of Gettysburg. And we'll just say, sometimes attributed to the Confederate loss. Not just the loss of the battle. Some people might even go far to say Pickett's charge caused the Confederacy to lose the entire war. So this was, an attack that was ordered from the South to the North across an open field. And Pickett's charge was a slaughter for the Confederacy. And, from that position, it was, the Confederacy was turned back and forced to retreat. So all of this is happening in the East. And so this is, really the first year in which the fighting around Virginia, right, the major big armies, that you've had a considerable good news. Meanwhile, in the West, where Grant is still in action, he's continuing to have success. The Battle of Vicksburg, this is once again Grant's successful we'll say capture of the Mississippi River. Essentially, the Union, or the North, had controlled all of the Mississippi River except for the part of it that was around Vicksburg, Mississippi. Grant and the Union Army successfully captured that city, giving the entire Mississippi River to Union control, which was, the Mississippi River is the biggest river in the United States. It's the most important, or it's one of the major ways to transport goods and other things. So once again, Grant is having, victory after victory after victory. Now, despite the Battle of Gettysburg and despite Union victory, this war has dragged on so far for 2 years. And as we will see in the next couple of points here, neither side is willing to surrender by 1863. In fact, the war is going to be fought for about 2 more years. And there's still a lot of fighting and dying to be had. In fact, most of those who died in the Civil War would die in the later stages. And so this reveals this desire by both sides to really fight to the end, right? Not quite a complete fight to the death, but certainly a fight to the very end. And as the war dragged on, both the Union and the Confederacy found difficulties in maintaining the war effort, that people began to feel the effects at home. And sometimes the Civil War gets described as a war of attrition. And a war of attrition is really a war to outlast the other side, right? That both sides had to make tremendous sacrifice. Both sides are bleeding out in terms of troops and money and supplies. who is going to give up first? And so, like mentioned earlier, initially when the war started, it was all volunteers, but both sides would eventually have to enact a draft. The Enrollment Act, this was a military draft. We'll say for the Union. And when the draft was enacted, there were a lot of people in the North who were in opposition for it, not just because they disagreed fundamentally with the war, not just because, and this is also an important thing to keep in mind, Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation. Remember that the Emancipation Proclamation, this was not something that was democratically voted on. It's not as if the people of the United States, in the North anyways, got to decide for themselves. This was issued by Abraham Lincoln as commander in chief. And so there were some people in the North that didn't like the Emancipation Proclamation, and they also didn't like the draft. And so these anti-war sentiments eventually erupt in a series of what for a very long time was the most expensive and deadliest riots in American history. And those were the New York City draft riots that occurred in 1863. Now, part of the reason that motivated the draft riots was mainly the Enrollment Act, right? The draft itself. I mean, they're called draft riots. But it was also one of the exemptions because you could pay $300 to avoid the draft. So if you had been conscripted in the North and you had enough money, there was a way for you to skip out on military service. And so as this popular refrain says, that the Civil War was referred to by many Northerners as, quote, a rich man's war, but a poor man's fight. Meaning that if you're too poor to avoid the draft, you were fighting, but if you're rich enough, then you could potentially get out of it. So the New York City draft riots were incredibly damaging. It was 4 days of riots. 120 were killed. 11 Black Americans were lynched. And it was only after the soldiers that had got back from the Battle of Gettysburg came to New York City did the draft riots actually stop. And what this revealed was a very important threat to the Northern War effort. And that is to say that when it came to the Northern War effort, that the question was, could the North keep public opinion for the war? Right? When we look at the North, it's not a matter of does the North have enough soldiers? The answer is yes. Do they have enough money? Yes. Do they have enough supplies? Yes. That's all true. But really, the way in which the North can lose the Civil War is something like the New York City draft riots happening in city after city after city after city. It eventually comes down to a question of, does the North have the will and the public confidence to continue fighting, right? And so these riots really reveal a serious threat to the overall Northern war effort. Now, for the South, as the war drags on, right, as it becomes a war of attrition, the question for the South is more about those supplies, right? The Confederacy, it's a question of, do they have enough soldiers? Do they have enough guns? Do they have enough money? And so likewise, the Confederacy will also enact a draft, right? Confederate draft, right? So we'll just say military draft. And unlike the North, it was not a matter of money. How much money did you have? It was enslaving more than 20 plus people. Exempted one from the draft. Meaning that slave owners that enslaved more than 20 people, those people were exempt from the draft. But to show a little bit more the side in which the South especially suffered given the material conditions was that you had a series of bread riots that broke out across Confederate cities. So of bread riots, we'll just say that the shortage of materials and troops, we'll say, threatened I'm out of room here. The Confederate war effort. One thing to take note is that when we start looking at events like the New York City draft riots, the type of bread riots that occurred in the South, we would identify these as the quote unquote home front, right? So there's the, just the front and, the military front in which the fighting and dying is taking place. But the Civil War was a little bit more total, meaning that people at home still felt the impact of it. And, this was true of the people living in the Confederacy when there was, a lack of supplies. One thing that we might take note of is that when it came to things like the bread riots, when it came to things like the home front, this was something that affected women and men. So we'll say about women, we'll say participated in bread riots. Women participated and felt the impact of the Civil War in other ways. Espionage was one way that women contributed to the conflict. So we might just take note that women participated as spies. We'll take note of a couple of other ways in which women participated, but as you can see in this image, one way will be in the position of nurses. And in fact, when you look at American society more broadly, one way in which the status of women changes from this war is that there tends to be a lot more opportunities available in things like the medical field. Women were mobilized to, care for soldiers who were injured and soldiers who had gone through various procedures. So whether it was participating in a bread riot or being a spy or helping out as a nurse, the Civil War was a little bit more total in which, men and women were both affected. Now, by the year 1864, right, so not that really the year-by-year account is incredibly important, but by 1864, the Confederate war effort is no longer in a position to invade Union territory. They've been turned back at the Battle of Gettysburg, and now it becomes a question of whether or not the Union can pursue the Confederate army to the point of surrender to where this secession movement is over. And so eventually, Grant, after all of these years, is appointed to be general in the East. And you might be saying, well, wait a minute, didn't the Union just win the Battle of Gettysburg, right? Isn't that good enough for Abraham Lincoln? Well, the answer is no, because even after the Battle of Antietam, when McClellan was fired, and after the Battle of Gettysburg, the Union Army let the Confederacy get away. They let them fight another day. And so the Union Army goes through a lot of military leaders, right? Hiring and firing. And eventually, Grant has had such success at the Battle of Shiloh, at the Battle of Vicksburg, that Abraham Lincoln says, look, this is my guy. I'm going to appoint him to be in charge of the Union forces in the East, right? The place where the fighting will determine the winner or the loser. And from 1864 to 1865, it's a question of General Grant for the Union versus General Lee of the Confederacy. This overland campaign, as it's called, is Grant's, we'll say, offensive against Lee and the retreating Confederacy. And it's in fact some of the most deadly fighting. See, because Grant in some ways is the opposite of McClellan. He understands that the Union has a much bigger army, and so he's much more aggressive. And in fact, in many of these battles during the Overland campaign, the Union has more casualties, meaning that more Union soldiers are dying in each and every battle But the point is that the Union also has more soldiers. So even if the Union is suffering higher casualties in each and every battle, the Union can replenish their forces. The Confederacy, they are the ones who are running low on soldiers. The population of the Union is like twice as big as the South. And in terms of those who can fight in the military, young men, specifically in the South, young men who aren't slaves, it's more like 4 or 5 to 1. So it's a much more aggressive tactic. It's a much deadlier fight, but it's one that at the end of the day is a more deadly fighting. One at the end of the day that is a winning strategy as far as the Union is concerned. Now, at the same time, while Grant is trying to pursue Lee, Lincoln and Grant allow for the Union General William Tecumseh Sherman. He is a Union general. He sets out and successfully captures Atlanta. Atlanta is located in Georgia. Again, this would be what we identified in the, in the Western Theater. Grant versus Lee, this is in the East. And Atlanta is important because Atlanta, Georgia is a place where a lot of railroads come together. And so Sherman was given the task to go into the heart of the Confederacy, capture Atlanta, Georgia, to disrupt the trains in the South from bringing Lee any more reinforcements, which he successfully does, right? He successfully does in 1864. And in many ways, the capture of Atlanta, that is, again, contributes to the good news as far as the Union war effort is, the war effort is concerned. Now, in terms of the casualties and fatalities of the war, many of them were due to disease. And medicine during the Civil War was not even, it wasn't close to being understood in the way that we understand it today. So medicine in the Civil War, we'll just say that germs were not well known. And about 50% of casualties were due to disease. Right, were due to disease. Because the germs weren't understood very well at the time, what it meant was that if you had a gunshot wound, there was really only one prescription, right? That was only one way they knew for sure that gunshot wound would not kill you, and that was amputation. And it was very common for soldiers to have their limbs amputated if they got shot. In fact, the way that one would most likely die on a battlefield was they would get shot, but in many cases, the gunshot would not be fatal. Some people did, of course, get shot to death, but you got shot in the arm, you got shot in the leg. And what would happen is that during the next couple of days or weeks, that gunshot would get infected and then you would die of the disease. They said that of Civil War doctors, that all you needed was a butcher's apron and a saw. And that was good enough to be a Civil War doctor because the prescription for every gunshot wound was amputation, amputation, amputation. Now, because both North and South needed to mobilize their population to fight this war effort, organizations like the United States Sanitary Commission, this was designed to, we'll say, to aid in the treatment of soldiers. An important point that we had made earlier was that many women served as nurses. And this was typically, the medical field was something that traditionally would have belonged to this earlier notion that we talked about of the separate spheres. And the separate spheres, this was the cultural idea that men and women should inhabit different areas in society, that there were male jobs and female jobs. Well, medicine was something that was considered a male job. But during the war, because women contributed in this fashion, medicine as a field became a lot more open for opportunities as far as women were concerned. We have a quote here from Mary Chestnut in 1865. She says, quote, "In the opinion of many, It is the privilege of woman to minister to the sick and soothe the sorrowing, and in the present crisis of our country's history, to aid our brothers to the extent of her capacity. Mary Chestnut, 1865. Another impact the war had on women in society was the large number of widows after the war was over. We'll just say that over 200,000 women were left as widows after the war. Now, as far as the conflict is concerned, as the war began to approach the year 1864, the Union was in somewhat of a peculiar position because 1864 was an election year. And the question was, would they hold a presidential election given the circumstances of the country, right? Is it a wise idea? And Abraham Lincoln actually insisted that an election be held. And in some ways, the election of 1864, we might say this is the last opportunity for the Confederacy to get a sort of like a compensated / negotiated peace. Meaning that by this point in the war in 1864, the war is not going good for the Confederacy on the battlefield. But there's a hope that maybe in this presidential election, that the North will elect somebody that is just not committed to fighting this war to the very end. And, consider some of the earlier things that we talked about, like the Copperheads, these anti-war Northerners. Consider the New York draft riots, where there were a lot of people in the North who were opposed to the draft and didn't see eye to eye. Lincoln himself personally was committed to fighting this war to its conclusion. So on the one hand, we had Abraham Lincoln, who had issued the Emancipation Proclamation, and again had done so in a way that was not, it wasn't democratically voted for or anything like that. And his challenger was George McClellan. And, this is one of those things in which, you really couldn't write a better script, because McClellan, who used to be the general of the Union Army, had been fired by Lincoln. Lincoln and McClellan hated each other. And McClellan himself, when he ran for presidency in 1864, he had a very clear position, and that was end the war. And so the question was left up to the American public. They would hold an election, and the American public would decide, does the country want to continue fighting this war to the very end? Does the country approve of Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation? Or is it those who are more akin to what happened in the New York City riots? Is it the Copperheads? Are there enough Americans to say, look, the bloodshed is not worth it. We need to have peace, and we need to stop sacrificing American lives. And the winner of the 1864 election was Abraham Lincoln. And with that, the last opportunity for the Confederacy to get some sort of peace settlement, right? Some sort of negotiation, that door closed, because there was no way that the South or Confederacy could hold on for another 4 more years. And they knew very well that Abraham Lincoln was prepared to fight this war into the very, very end, and would only accept an unconditional surrender of the South. So Lincoln's victory in 1864 in many ways sealed the fate of the Confederacy. In his second inaugural address in 1865, Lincoln said, quote, "With malice towards none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right as God give us to see the right, let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who shall have borne the battle, and his widow and his orphan, to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace among ourselves and with all nations." So Lincoln very clearly is already gearing his speech here towards a rebuilding project. And in fact, in the very next chapter, we're going to learn about a period in American history called Reconstruction. And Reconstruction is the time period after the Civil War. But despite Lincoln's election in 1864, the war continued, and it wouldn't be another couple of months before the Confederacy would officially surrender. After General Sherman captured Atlanta, he engaged in what is what is referred to as the March to the Sea. This is William Sherman's. Again, William Sherman is a Union general. Military campaign to destroy the Confederacy. In this campaign, Sherman went from town to town, city to city, completely destroying everything in his path, right? Atlanta to South Carolina. And, Sherman was someone who held a deep hatred for the Confederacy, viewed them as traitors. And when we get to the next chapter on Reconstruction, there's an element of Reconstruction that has to do with the physical rebuilding of the country. And a lot of that destruction was done by Sherman and his March to the Sea. Typically, when we think about Reconstruction, we think of it more in the sense of what Lincoln said, and that was to, where does he say heal the wounds? Here it is, to bind up the nation's wounds, meaning that Reconstruction, yes, there's a physical rebuilding aspect to it, but it's also about rebuilding the relationship. But in terms of the damage to infrastructure and the physical damage inflicted upon the Confederacy, much of it came in 1864 and 1865 from this March to the Sea. Back in Virginia, Grant was still in relentless pursuit of Lee, and it was at Appomattox Courthouse that eventually Robert E. Lee surrendered to Ulysses S. Grant, making it the last battle of the Civil War.